Good afternoon, everybody. This is Billy Ward. Looking forward to spending some time with you here in a moment. We are going to give everybody a minute or two to go ahead and get settled in and logged in, and we'll start the presentation. Thank you very much. Good afternoon again. I'm seeing most people are getting logged in and getting into the program here this afternoon. Start with some housekeeping stuff before we kick off the presentation, and that should give everybody a time to get logged in. Welcome. I'm looking forward again to this month's office hours. Today we're going to be talking about query. Just as a reminder, this is actually a two-part office hours session. So today is going to be primarily focused on the basic usage of query, getting comfortable to where the information in our new query function lives and how it looks and how to operate it, especially for our users that may have been using our older version of query, kind of introduce you to some of the new ways you can replicate some of the queries that you have been using and understand the information that you're viewing in the new version of query. A couple of things to look out for. If you have any questions, please put them into the question box, submit them through the webinar question box. That way we'll be able to answer them at the end of the presentation. If you have any technical issues or anything like that, please feel free to put a note in the chat. After the presentation today, we are going to be sending out a survey. Survey basically, just helps me know that I'm doing a good job or if I need to do something better, but as well as helps us pick and determine some of our new topics for future presentations. So again, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get started on the presentation here. For those of you that know me or have been on my previous calls, you know I was kind of sick of that same old picture. So I'm trying to change it up. Turns out there's not too many good pictures of me where I'm not looking super goofy. So if anybody has good pictures of me, feel free to send them into Cargas so we can use them for these webinars because I need a little variety. But anyway, for those I haven't met, my name's Billy. I've been with Cargas about 4.5 years, and I've been in the consultant role for that period of time. My plan for today's presentation, again, talking about the basics of query, is really looking at where to find and how to operate our new query tool. So that includes looking at our data sources, and some of these data sources have changed or have new names, but there are also some more descriptions associated with them to kind of help users identify what query you need to run for what piece of information. We'll look at setting up a query by selecting the different fields, how to group and do calculations on your query. We'll also look at some basic filtering and sharing of that query, as well as how we would run the final query product and export that out into Excel. My hope for everybody today is to really just get more familiarity and more comfort with the new query tool and run some basic uh, reports that you would run in the old tool in the new one. Like I said before, we are going to talk about more advanced filtering options and query maintenance coming up next month on our office hours. So now that we talked about our agenda, basically, we're going to go ahead and dive in and take a look at the query tool. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm in a example site here, and from our reports menu, we have our query options here. You'll notice that for companies that have been using our classic query prior to the new version being released, that information is still accessible. When you're ready to start using new query, reach out to us via support ticket and we can help you get set up with those application settings that need to be turned on so that you have access to it. Now, our new query tool functions very differently than our old. So it's not going to convert any existing queries that you have in the classic query to the new version. That would have to be replicated manually. So you would still have access to the classic query even when the new query is activated. So you would be able to take your time and move over and recreate those reports in the new version of query. We do have the query report that you can run, and that helps some users replicate those queries in the new version. I'm going to go here. I'm going to go to Reports Query and go to our new query. And this will bring us into the new version of our query tool. So a couple of things to look at here is any query favorite that you have saved is going to be visible here to you. So here are some queries that we've created or I've created just to have as a favorite. And we'll look at how we save these in a moment. But these queries are available to us to run. Now, if it's a query that somebody else has created, but they've also given you the right to edit that query, this edit icon here will allow you to make edits to the query structure, filtering, and so on and so forth. Now, if this is a report that somebody else has shared with me, but did not give me the option to edit, I would not have this functionality here. I would just be able to run the report with the existing parameters that have already been established by the creator of the report. And we'll look at how you can share and choose who gets to see what and do what here in a moment. I always like to point out, when in doubt, we do have that question mark up there, kind of gives you a little bit of a tour about what you're looking at on the query screen. So if you ever want a quick refresher, forget what we talk about today, that's perfectly okay. You can always press this. It gives you a quick tour of the query function and the different query screens that we'll be looking at. I'm going to select the New Query button to build a new report from scratch. So to do that, I'll press New Query, and you'll see we have a list of data sources. These list of data sources are all the different parameters or data sets that you can pull to build your report. So each of these has a name and a description. The description is really helpful when you're trying to determine what pieces of information you're going to be running on this query. For those of you that remember the old query version, if you were using that, these were those query objects that you would eventually use to create favorites. That has become data sources here. Not too much has changed. These are fairly similar in what information ends up getting pulled when we look at a query. One thing I do want to look at are our different tank options. We kind of broken out some different tank data sources to provide more specific data information that might be a little different than what you're used to seeing on the previous query function. So one of them is going to be the tank attributes information. So let me pull that one up here. The tank attributes data set is most similar to the tanks query that you're used to seeing if you ran a tanks report in the previous query version. So this is just basic tank information as it pertains to the records that are set up on customers' accounts. So this is, what delivery type a customer has, what fuel product is delivered into that tank, what tanks are active or inactive. We also have a tank schedule query, and this is for your scheduled deliveries. This is to help look at and evaluate what schedules are on a particular customer's account. So if you have a tank that's scheduled to receive daily deliveries every 3 days, you can actually run reports and see who has what type of schedule. Is it daily, weekly, monthly, and so on and so forth, and what that interval is. The tank's additional information is a little more of a focused version of the tank's attribute report. The tank's additional information is going to be showing us a more detail about the tanks on a customer's account. So some additional details on here that get used often when people run this report as opposed to the generic tanks attribute report is the tank's additional information also includes serial number information. So usually if we're running some sort of report to tie into serial numbers and dates, set dates, reclaim dates, and so on and so forth, our tank's additional information is going to be a great place to start. When you review this and find the data set that you're looking for, I'm going to run, for our example, transactions, customer. I'm just going to run a customer transaction query, just as a for instance. So now that I've chosen what data I want to pull, I can press the next button. Now included on this next set is really determining what fields and information we are going to see on this query report. So in the past, when we would run our old query, you would open up the data set and basically you would just see a screen with all the available fields. Well, instead of starting with everything and kind of parsing it back, what we're going to do here is we're actually going to go through and format our query report first and then run the report after we format that. So let's say I want to see a report on how many gallons a customer has purchased or customers have purchased based on a date range or group by fuel type, something along those lines. What we would do is first find the different fields that we would like to include in this query. So maybe I want to see date. We'll say activity date. Maybe I want to see customer information like customer name. We'll say item number, quantity. And as you go through this, you can see there's additional information that you can plug in. Any of these available fields can be brought over into the included fields. Anything on the included fields are what we're going to see on our report. Now, it's not necessarily relevant to the data set that I selected with the transactions customer, but if you chose to run a query that doesn't by default also include customer account information like account number, name, address, you can actually choose to include those fields as well. So if I was running this report and it didn't already have customer name or some of that address information, I would be able to select this include customer fields option, and that include customer fields option would also give me additional available fields that weren't already included, and that's just pulling from the customer account query data set. So that would be a way to kind of merge the customer account information data set into another query so that you can use those fields as well. As far as available fields go, I'm going to keep this one kind of simple just for the sake of conversation today. But one thing I do want to do is I want to set up a grouping as well as a sum of total quantity. In order to do that, I'm going to choose a summary query. Once I've selected that I want to run this as a summary query, I get to choose how to define that. So the first thing that I would like to do is I'd like to group my report by the item number. So I'm going to select the aggregate icon here, and you can see the delivery item number by default, because this is just a text field, it's going to give me the option to group by the delivery item number. Under total quantity, I'm going to add that into, and I'm going to tell Cargas that I'm going to sum total quantity by delivery item number. So when I get to the point where I'm actually running this report, the report will group everything by the delivery item number and then give me a grand total quantity of those different item numbers that were included on my transactions. You can see there are additional fields, or additional types rather, that you can use on here. I could do averages, I can do counts, and so on and so forth. But for my example right now, I'm going to choose a sum. You'll notice here that now that I have these two set up for their summary settings, my two remaining fields are still in alphabetical order. Any of your fields, if you want to change the order of information or change the order of how the columns will lay out, you can actually just click and hold and drag and just reorder the columns so that the columns are in their proper order when you actually run your report. I'm going to click next, and our next step is going to be looking at some basic filters that we can put on this report. So once I hit the next button, we have the option here to go ahead and put in our setup conditions, which are basically filters. So I'm going to hit add rule, and all of these rules basically become filters for when we run the report. So the first thing I say I want to do is I want to see just the quantities from deliveries from the last year to date. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put an activity date filter. So I'm going to use that column to be my filter. And you can see from the filter type dropdown, I have a couple different options. So I can do equal to a specific date. I can do not equal to a specific date, less or more or greater than or equal to. These are fairly similar to the options you used to have in the old query system when you were running filters. However, they're defined as opposed to using symbols like we used to use. In this case, I'm going to use the between option. And when I do that, this will allow me to select a start and an end date for the results that I want to see on this report. I also have this option to prompt for value. If I select that, that tells Cargas that this is a report that I'm basically going to save, but I may want to use different activity date filters every time I run this report. So what Cargas will do, instead of saving a specific start date and end date and making you edit the filters every time you run it for different dates, when you go to run the report and press the run button, Cargas is going to prompt you to fill in a start date and an end date to receive the results that you're looking for. And I will do it here when I run this report in just a moment. Another option here that I might want to do is I want to tell Cargas that this is only for deliveries. So I'm going to add another rule by pressing add rule. And I'm going to find document type. Now, when we use for specific data fields, we have the option to filter using the in option. When that's available to you, what it will do, instead of having to define the list yourself, it will give you a list of available options to filter on. And you can just go through this list and check off any of the ones that might be relevant to the report that you're running. So in this case, I'm going to select delivery, but maybe I also want to include wholesale deliveries as well. I'm going to select that as a secondary option. So now this will be filtered down to just deliveries or wholesale deliveries, because I've selected these two for a specific date range that I'll define when I actually run this report. You can keep adding on to these different rules if you wanted to do this by a particular customer type or any other of those available fields. You can add that in here too. One thing I do like to point out, in the previous step, if I had selected the include customer fields, you would also have the option to add filters based on those customer fields too. So it would work just like it was a part of the original query to begin with. So you don't have to worry about not being able to use those customer fields. If they weren't already available in this report, you can include the customer fields in the query and still be able to filter on them. Before I run this, I'm going to go ahead and save this as a query favorite so that it's available on my query screen from that menu. So if I do that, I'm going to press the save button, and I'm going to give the query a name. And we'll give it a description as well. I always get a little nervous when I'm typing, so I hate to show how bad of a speller I am. So hopefully everything worked out good. I'm not getting any red lines, so I think we're all right. But what you'll do is you'll give the query a name and give it a little bit of a description so that when you're looking at your list of favorites, you know what type of query it is, you know what's going on, and you can select that to run or edit. When I press save, that has saved it on my query favorites list. And by default, because I was the one who created it to begin with, I already have the option to edit that report or run that report whenever I want. Now, let's say I want to share this report with other users in the office and give some of them the option to run it or the option to edit and run it as well. To do that, we're going to press the security icon. And it's this icon here that looks like a padlock. Or actually, I've had some users tell me it looks like a purse, but I think it's a padlock. If you press that, it shows you a list of all your users as they are set up under the security settings in your office. So you'll see your list of Cargas users. As you go through this list, you can give any of the users the option to run this report. If I give just the option to run the report, they'll see it as a report on their favorites, but they will not have the edit option. Now, if I give anybody the option to edit it, by default, I'm also giving them the option to run this as well. So obviously, if I have the right to edit the report, I'll also have the right to edit it or to run it as well. Or I can just run it without being able to edit. If you have security groups set up, you'll actually be able to also offer the edit or run to anybody in a security group. So your security group would actually be listed here, and you can add that setting to allow to edit or run or both to that security group. So anybody with that security group listing on their security setup would have the same permission that you have set there. When you've selected who you would like to share this with, just press the Save button. And that will save that option. And now the next time those users access their query, they'll see that favorite saved for them. You do have the option also at this point, if you want to edit the name or description of the query, hit the pencil icon here. That will edit that description as it would display for all of the users you've shared this report with. Or if this favorite no longer serves a purpose, you can always press the trash can here, and that will delete it as a favorite. If you make any changes to the filters or the columns or the general parameters of the report, just make sure to hit the Save button so that those new options, as long as you want them to be, are something you want the other users to see, or the change be active the next time you run this report. You just want to make sure you press the Save button with any changes. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and run the report. And I'm going to run this for, I'm going to say for 2 years to date. And I'm going to press run. And it's going to retrieve our results. So I'm going to expand some of these columns here so we can see what we're looking at. So you can see here are our columns that we selected when we built this query. This is showing all of the results. Now, I selected the grouping to group by delivery item number. So here are all the delivery item numbers that we grouped together. If I press the arrow here, that will actually expand out and show me the specific transactions, in this case, that make up those numbers. So by selecting the auto gas, I can see that, Ms. Jones, I guess, had 2 deliveries back in March, and they turned, or 1 in March, 1 in May, and that makes up to these 500 gallons that we delivered here. If I wanted to view all of the results, I can actually expand the entire query out by just pressing the expand button at the very top row. And it takes a second, but then that loads for us here. If I open one of these up, and let's say I want to add additional filters that are just a temporary way of organizing the information I'm viewing here from these drop-down menus on any of these columns, I can actually add additional filters. Now, these aren't filters that would save for when we run the report, because that would really be done either through setting up rules or through our summary query setup feature. This would just be a temporary filter or grouping that we would add onto this just for the sake of viewing this report this specific time in a certain way. So I can add, like I said, an additional filter here to clear this down. You can also select any of the column heads to sort if you wanted to sort a different way than it is by default. Last thing I want to show here, or one of the last things, is underneath this Run button, there is actually a menu. And from this menu, we have a couple of different options here. So you can clear all grid filters. That would only apply to the filters that you added on as a temporary filter through the column header. You can export all data as a CSV. Basically, what that would do is take any of this information that's on this report, even if it's nested underneath the delivery item number in this case, it would spit it all out into an Excel spreadsheet that you can continue to work with. If we exported the visible data as a CSV, I would only get the information that's currently visible on the report. So all of these details that are hidden, all of the specific transaction lines that are hidden from this report would not export out in that case. So if I did the export visible data as a CSV, only what I see here would export out. And you also have the option to hide specific columns. So if I wanted to hide any of these columns, I could just press that and the column is hidden, and I could export visible data as a for instance. And then just press that to come back. So I'm going to bring us back to our query favorites page. And you can see here's my office hours with Billy example that I created. If I did want to make any edits, I would just press this edit icon. And now I'm back to kind of where we started, where you would be selecting the particular fields that you would be adding in. At this point, since I've already saved it as a favorite, we've already locked in our data source. So we couldn't really change up data sources because you'd basically be redoing the whole query from scratch anyway. If I wanted to make a similar query, but with slightly different columns or slightly different filters, but in essence, it's the same and you don't want to start entirely from scratch, we have a copy icon. If you press that, it will make a new query for you, copying the details that you currently have for this particular favorite. And then what you can do is you can just work off of that, give it a new name, save it as a favorite if you want. But that way you can kind of take the basic structure of this query and then rework it to match your particular report that you want to do if it's a little off from this. So at this point, we looked at creating a query, pulling in the columns, choosing the summary information, as well as basic filtering function in our query report. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the questions in the question box. Any questions that you have, go ahead and put them in the question field through the webinar, and we're going to answer that. So bear with us one quick second. I'm going to bring up our questions and see what we can do to help out. Okay, great question came through. Question is, in our example here, we're grouping by item number, but how can we also sum the quantity for each customer? Well, what we would do in that case is we would want to add additional summaries into this. So what we could do is if you had customer name or customer address or customer ID number, whatever you would want to use to group that, you can choose that as an additional total field. So I would select, in this case, I would add in customer name, and I'm going to tell Cargas to group by item number, group by customer name, and then total the quantity. But it's important that we have this in the right order. So in this case, I'm going to click and drag and drop this in. There we go. So basically, I'm telling Cargas this is the order of operations. And essentially what we're doing is we're saying first we're going to group by item number, then underneath that we're going to group by customer name, and then we're going to total the quantities for each of those. So with that change, I'm going to save this and I'm going to run this report for the last 2 years so you can see what this looks like when I run it. So you can see here, we run this report. It looks pretty much the same right now until I expand out these delivery item number subset. Now I have this group by customer with total quantity. So in this case, what you'll get is not only the total quantity for, in my example here, propane, but then broken down by customer. And if I want to see the specific transactions, I can expand those as well and see the specific transactions. The next question is, do you have to have the available field in the query in order to filter by that information? You do not. So if there was something I wanted to put a filter on in this report, maybe I just want to see active customers, for example. As long as that active customer field is available here when we're looking at our potential columns, I don't actually have to have that included in the report. So if I don't want to see it, that's perfectly fine. But as long as it's an available field to you here or by including customer fields, when we get to the filter, you can add a filter to this report, even though it's not a column you're viewing on the report, and it will use that to filter for you. The next question we have here is if you give another user their permission to edit the query, what will you see the next time you run it? So any edits that that person makes to a query. So if they edit, if the secondary user edits a filter or a column, if they edit that and press save, you will see their edits the next time you run the report. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that if they make changes and they don't save it, maybe they want to run the report a little differently this one time. So they add a different filter in. But if they don't save that change, you will notice no difference the next time you run the report. Something else that I like to point out is when I go to my query screen, you will be able to view who the last person to use this report was and at what time they ran that report. So there is a little bit of tracking to that, knowing what user has been in your query last. Any other questions that we can answer for you at this time about the basic query structure? Another question just came in. If you received a shared query, can you copy it and then make changes and save? As long as you have the rights to edit, you'll be able to make a copy. And then once that copy is made, that would be a completely separate query favorite you're dealing with. And that copy, you can do everything with any changes that you would want. Another question had come in here. Where can we find a list of fields in each data set? That's a great question. Actually, some of this is so new to us, and we've created some of those new query data sources that we're still we don't have a list yet where you would have all those available fields. So I know it's something that's been on the radar for us. So be on the lookout for that. I just don't believe anything's been published yet. While we're waiting for any last minute questions to come through, I'll just put out another little reminder here. You will be getting a survey about this office hours this month. Please feel free to fill that out with any suggestions or advice. It's important. It helps us kind of determine that we're on the right path and we're being helpful, and also helps us determine what our other topics should be. So we plan to do this pretty much every month. We might take a slight break over winter when people are at their busiest and it might not be quite as convenient, but it really does help us determine what are some great topics that we can help and share with. I'll also remind you that this is a two-part series, so there is a sequel coming up. Next month, we're doing part 2 of query training, where we take more specific examples and more advanced filtering and exporting that we can do. So we're roughly at the 45-minute mark here. I don't see any other questions coming through. I can hang on for a moment or two, but without any other questions, we can go ahead and call it a day for part 1 of query training. Thank you all again for your time. I hope this is helpful and enjoyable, and maybe I provide a laugh or two along the way, that it's a good time for everybody. So I appreciate everybody coming into our office hours, and I'll hold on for a moment or two and see if there's any other questions that come in under the gun here. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a really great afternoon. Okay, it doesn't look like we have any more questions. We're going to call it a wrap for today. If you do have any questions, please feel free to create a support ticket. Otherwise, I hope you join us again when we do our next presentation next month. Check out your Cargas announcements for this sign up information, and we'll hope to see you then. Have a great day, everybody.